It's a great pleasure to meet again after 65 years or so my school friend Philip Steadman. And Philip, can you tell me first when and where you were born?
I was born in Northwich in Cheshire on the 9th of July 1942. And my mother was Dorothy. My father was Fred. We were there in Northwich because my father was a chemical engineer and he worked at a factory. He worked for ICI, factory making caustic soda. And we lived in a village outside called Hertford, near Northwich. In Walnut Lane, small house. Later my father got higher up in the works at Winnington, and we lived in Walnut Lodge, which was the big house at the end of the lane, which had the walnuts, I think, as far as I can remember. I don't know where my father and mother met. My mother died when I was 16, and I never talked to her when I was grown up, which I wish I had. But they either met in Yorkshire, in Wakefield, where they both grew up, or they met at Oxford. They were both studied at Oxford. My father read chemistry, my mother read literature, English literature. And most of my family came from Yorkshire, almost all. My father's father was a coal miner in Wakefield. I never met him. He died before I was born. My mother's father was, I never knew his name. He was always called Pa. I met him lots of times, but I never knew his real name. He was a bookbinder and worked in a factory that made ledgers and printing works, made ledgers and account books, and I went to see that with my grandfather. My father and mother, well, I know less about my mother, but my father wrote a little memoir, I think, possibly for publication, but at any rate it was for us. So I learned more about his life before my life. From that, and I've been looking at it again more recently. In my grandfather's house there were some books. He was a man who, there was some kind of music and books, I think. My father got to grammar school in Wakefield, which he describes in the 1930s as being, the teaching was rather dilatory. You imagine it would be rather academic, but apparently you could learn if you wanted to. And he and a friend of his called Jewett decided that they wanted to learn mathematics and science, and they did reasonably well. And they decided that they would try for Oxford, which was a fantastical idea, of course. And they told the science master, "We're not going to be here much next week. We're trying for Oxford." And the master said, "Oh," not sort of "can we help" or "good luck" or anything. They didn't get in. But later there was a scholarship. There was a competitive examination at the school for miners' sons for scholarships, which he won. So he got to Oxford and got a first in chemistry. Further back, I know less about my mother's trajectory, but she also must have followed something of a similar route. Mm. Well, as I said, her father was worked in bookbinding, and I was fascinated by his work because he did, if you remember those old account books, they had ruled lines, which were, I became interested in printing later on, but these weren't exactly printed. You had long sheets of paper that were pushed through under a gantry, which had lots of pens across and made all the lines, and then you turned it round and made the lines go in the other direction. and then he did the marbling for the end papers and so on. He had a party trick. He would, you could give him a stack of paper, and he would feel one between his fingers, and he would then go through with his thumb and tell you how many there were. Whether he actually could do it, I don't know. I never saw him test it. But my brother did some work trying to follow the family further back and ran out in the 18th century. I think there was a family Bible which had names. They were small farmers, I think, in Yorkshire, mostly.
What about the characters of your parents? I mean, in what way did they influence you?
Yes. My father, as you can imagine, was a driven man, really. He was very kind, but he was always a bit daunting to me. We would shake hands when we say goodbye or said hello. He intellectual, a man of wide interests, reading and music and so on. He played the French horn. I think as the second son, I had an elder brother, James, who's dead now, but my brother, I think, was very much in his shadow, and he too read chemistry at Oxford and went into ICI, and I rather thought that he shouldn't have done that. I, as a second son, I think escaped a bit. And I always felt that I had never quite lived up to my father's expectations. I did later on. He even when I was a lecturer here in Cambridge, he would say, "When are you going to get a real job?" But later on, I did things that I think pleased him. My mother, I mean, you know, I only knew her as I said, was that when I was a child. I think she was a romantic. She liked poetry. She liked gardening. We went to France a few times. She loved France, Switzerland. But I wish I knew more. That's how I would characterise her. I think if she'd been born one generation later, she would have had a career of some kind. I learned from my sister just last week that she was a teacher for a time, but didn't enjoy it and gave it up. But I'm sure she would have done other things. She just became a housewife and looked after us. My family, on my father's side, were very much involved in education. I mean, they all valued education. My father's younger sister, Nell, became a primary school teacher and then a teacher training. His younger brother, Ralph, became a university lecturer, I think in physics, chemistry, I'm not sure. So there was a lot of... his family certainly went into education.
Tell me what your first specific memory was, and roughly how old you were. Not just sort of trees waving in the breeze above your pram, but...
I find that very difficult to answer. I do have memories of the first house we lived in, not very strong, but I can sort of see it in the garden and the... But first memory, goodness me. I find I have memories of places rather than events. So I can remember quite well that the houses we lived in and the school I went to this was of course not exactly first memories, but I went to a nursery school called the Grange School, and but you're asking me about earlier memories than that.
So often it's actually a painful memory. You know? Mine is breaking my arm and that sort of thing.
Yes, I don't remember anything of that kind. I remember playing under a big holly tree with toy cars.
How old would you have been then?
I don't notice the passing of years and dates and so on. I know you do, but
Well, when you're playing with cars, it's usually 6 or 7.
Yes, that may be a bit older, yes. Some of the things I do remember, but maybe this is kind of remembering them in retrospect, as it were. There were a few memories of the war. There were gas masks in the house. There was an Anderson shelter in the garden. I do remember that. My father was he was in a reserved occupation, so he was there during the war, but he volunteered for the Royal Observer Corps, so he sat on a roof watching the planes that were going over to bomb Liverpool, the docks. And he told me he read Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire while he was waiting. But he had he had a set of, this must be when I was a bit older, but he had a set of cards, this sort of size, with the silhouettes of German and English airplanes, Heinkels and Messerschmitts and so on. And we played with those when we were children, a great stack of them. I can't think of.
You don't have to.
No. I can remember the events at the nursery school, and I remember this. Well, I'll tell you one thing that might have been significant that I realised much later. The school was several buildings, but one of them was a modernist building, a rather fine, very small classroom building with big windows facing south, as I now realise, very much a kind of building of its time, a school of its time, with a climbing frame. And when I became an architect and studied architecture here, and I discovered that this building was designed by Leslie Martin, who was the professor of architecture when I became a student here. So, and I can remember the building well, and so maybe it had some kind of influence. It had, of course, very small chairs, very small furniture, and this climbing frame, which was, I only realised this, of course, it was inspired by Corbusier's Brise Soleil for the League of Nations building on a kind of 6-foot scale. So, and I remember I was in a play. I was in Alice Through the Looking Glass. I played a lizard, and Miss Taylor lowered me down a chimney. I can't remember quite why that. And we made, this is an awful memory, we did sewing, and we made gollywogs.
A word you should hardly pronounce.
I should hardly even say it, should I? Out of black American cloth, yes. Well, you know, there were gollywogs in the jars of marmalade in those days, Robertson's marmalade. Yes. I don't know what else I remember.
Do you remember any particular things you enjoyed doing? Were you a collector or a nature rambler or a hobbyist of any kind?
I always enjoyed making things, making models. That I suppose is a bit later, but I made model buildings. I was interested in, I mean, this must have been when I was a bit older, I suppose, but I was interested in drawing. I love drawing, and I still do. What else?
You didn't visit buildings, churches?
I did. Yes. I decided that I wanted to be an architect, really quite early on.
Like what sort of?
I don't know. It must have been, maybe it was 10 or something. But I no idea why. I didn't really know what an architect was. I don't think there were any architects that I knew or any in the family. But I knew obviously it involved buildings, and I went to see old churches and made drawings, and a bit later I did painting. And my father was a kind of a Sunday painter, so we made paintings together. I usually chose architectural subjects. My father's works, they had quite a lot of buildings they'd accumulated, various old houses and so on. And there was I suppose a surveyor who was in charge of them, and my father arranged for me to shadow him. And so I didn't learn much about architecture, but I learned a lot about rot, which didn't come in very useful later on. But yes, I don't know where. But as I say, from really early on, I wanted to be an architect.
Well, by the time you were 10, you were already at your preparatory boarding school
Was, yes.
in Oxford. Why you came? That's where we met.
Yes.
At the Dragon School in
Yes.
North Oxford. Why had your parents sent you to that school? Do you know?
I don't. I guess. Well, they wanted me and my brother, certainly me and my brother, to have the best education they could give us. I just imagine they might have found out about the Dragon School while they were students in Oxford, but otherwise I don't know. I don't know. Perhaps there were other people they knew who had children there. I don't know. But it was, I mean, we travelled across country. I was a boarder at the Dragon School. Went at the age of 8. Now it seems very strange to send your children off to the other end of the country at that kind of age. But then when you're a child, you go where you're told, don't you? And that was what happened. I was happy there.
All the way through, right from the beginning.
Well, I was homesick at the beginning, but yes, I was. I mean, it was as you know, it was a school that was friendly and welcomed you, and you had quite a lot of freedom to do things that you enjoyed doing, and I enjoyed the classes and the subjects. I was interested in we did everything, of course. But yes, I had a good time, and I enjoyed. It was Gert Sommerhoff teaching science, who I discovered later was a considerable scientist in his own right. In fact, he was a fellow for a time at University College. My
and he was at Trinity.
Yes, and he wrote about theoretical biology. That I, of course, knew nothing of. But he ran this, as you remember, this wonderful laboratory with all kinds of entertainments and scientific demonstrations. But he had a Wimshurst machine that had sort of circus figures who were electrified and so on. And he made wonderful radio-controlled vehicles, airplanes and so on. Yes, that I remember very vividly. But there were also the river and boating, and I was thinking just the other day about skating. That the school had skates for everyone, and when Port Meadow, the water meadows, froze in Oxford, everything was. All classes were cancelled and we all went skating for days on end. It was fantastic.
Jock loved, the headmaster loved skating.
Yes, and there was a sunken tennis court in front of Jock's schoolhouse that they laid down newspapers and sprayed at night in order to make a rink there. But that was the start. I'm not a sportsman of any kind at all, but I have loved skating for the rest of my life. I don't do it now in case I fall over and break something, but you always fall over skating, but so I don't do it. But I really loved skating. I have I've worked in Holland a bit, and I have a good friend there, Mark van Luysen. And in Holland, when it freezes very hard, they have this tour of all the cities of Holland, 11 cities, I think. And I said to him, Mark, tell me because you don't know when it's going to happen. And I said, ring me up when it's going to be the 11 cities tour. And he rang me up one day and said, Phil, we're starting tomorrow morning early. I couldn't go, but that was, I think, my chance. It's now gone, of course. It's not going to happen again. But yes, I remember that very vividly. There was a master called Copleston who taught geography. Spear, he was known as Spear, but I don't know why he was Spear. He had a motorbike. And I remember him skating with his crash helmet on. And, strange things you remember. I also remember him on his bicycle on a very hot day, coming across the playing fields down to the river. There was a steep slope, and he came on his bike and down the slope and straight into the river on his bike.
Intentionally?
Absolutely. Terrific. I had there was a master called Gordon Brady who taught English, and there was a group of us, and 4 or 5 boys and 1 girl. There were a few girls at school, Susan Rove. And I remember going with him in his, we were all fitted, but anyway, he had a sports car, and we went to Woodstock and had a beautiful day there. And he took us out to lunch, and he had one of the old £5 notes. I think one of the few times I've ever seen one of those really big ones with only printed on one side. And he paid for it. I mean, it was a lot of money. We didn't spend it all on that.
And you kept a diary. I mean, there was a competition, wasn't there?
There was, yes. That was good. In the summer holidays, we were all asked, but anyway, I certainly did for several years, however long it was, 3-4 years. And the diary had lined on one side and plain paper on the other, and so you were invited to write and stick in pictures and draw pictures and so on. I did that. And I still have them. So I'm reminded of...
And you won a prize, I expect?
Well, I expect everybody won prizes, I don't know. I won 2 prizes that I do remember. I won a prize for maths, and I still have the book that I got. It was all books, wasn't it? And I won a prize for woodwork. So maybe...
In the Barsonry.
In the Barsonry. So maybe there's architecture there in mathematics and woodwork, I don't know. But yes, yes. I'm trying to remember that it was a really interesting... Was it No, not Mathematics for the Million. It was an interesting book about strange subjects in mathematics. But it was, a serious book. Kind of mathematical recreations, I suppose.
You're obviously very, academically very good. You said you weren't keen on sports, so... You didn't get into top teams of sports?
Not at all, no. I remember a spectacular failure of a cricket team in which I think we were all out for 10 or something, and I was batting at number 10 probably. No, I never was enthusiastic about it. I went on to Winchester.
Yes.
And there we were obliged to take part in sports. But there was a regime where you could choose. I think we had to do some team sports, which I never enjoyed, and there was a very vicious something like the Eton Wall game, but a kind of football game which I had to take part in. But you could choose to do exercise on your own of a certain required amount, length of time. You could run, and I did running because that was over quickly. But I also did sculling, which I enjoyed a lot, because you were on your own, and once you got away from the boathouse, you could mess about. And yes, I liked doing that. I must tell you a story. At Winchester, it was divided into I won a scholarship, and all the scholarship boys were together in the medieval buildings, and so it was a sort of concentration of swats and weeds. And for this football game, there was a tournament there were 70 scholars, and they put up one team, and then there were 400 other boys, and they drew 2 teams from that 400. And there was this myth perpetrated that when the college won in this competition, college boys won, there would be a great feast.
And the college boys were the scholars? The
scholars. When the scholars won, there would be this feast with barrels of cider and blackberry and apple. And our team won when I was there. I wasn't on it, of course, but we won. It's fantastic. And to their credit, the college produced barrels of cider and bowls of blackberry and apple. It's fantastic. Yes.
Tell me, we're now on to Winchester, which is a very academic school.
Yes.
Did you enjoy that?
I did, yes. Not all the time, but I did enjoy it. I specialise in sciences, mathematics, which was a subject I loved. Physics. I didn't like chemistry. Maybe there was something Oedipal going on there. I failed my O-level chemistry exams, but no, I did enjoy it. It was very high-minded. We were really, what's the word? Anyway, we read the Times, and boys had gramophones and listened to classical music, and we, had readings of Shakespeare. And it really was. Although I do remember an occasion when the film of Rock Around the Clock came out, and people were tearing up cinema seats, and the master of the college came down and wanted to hear Rock Around the Clock on the gramophone, and he listened and went away again. So there was
Because 56, 57 was the rock revolution.
Was it? Yes. Well, that was
the time of Elvis, but also Buddy Holly and
Buddy Holly. I'm a great admirer of Buddy Holly. Yes.
You didn't form a group.
No, I have a good friend, Phil Tabor, another architect, who was a member of the North London Buddy Holly Appreciation Society, but I never became that. But no, we listened to Radio Luxembourg secretly and so on. But mostly, again, there was quite a lot of time to yourself in Winchester, and I loved the landscape around, of course, the watermeadows and Hampshire, and we could, bicycle. We could escape quite a lot. And I did painting, and there was an old boy who had left a printing press to the college, to the school, with a lot of type, and a good friend of mine, Alex Reed, and I started a printing society, and we printed various things. We printed some prayer books, which was rather strange. We also discovered that we had I don't know whether you remember that in those days the railway tickets were little pieces of green card about that size, and we discovered that we had the type used for printing railway tickets, and they had a serial number which was unique for each one, but there was a little device that you could put on the printing press, and we had one which clicked on, and it was like sort of a mileometer on a bicycle or something. It clicked on one number every time you worked the press, and we printed railway tickets, and we went to the Isle of Wight on these. My early career in forgery. Yes, that's right. But yes, and I met some good friends, made some good friends who are still friends.
One feature of around that age, certainly in mine, was that you are confirmed. I haven't asked about your parents' religious backgrounds, but and it may be partly related to that and puberty and so on. It's the time of often most interest in religion of various kinds. What was your experience of that?
Well, Winchester was a very religious school. We had services, I think, twice a day and 3 times on Sunday. So we spent a lot of time. I don't know what I believed at the time, but in my family, we never went to church. We weren't baptized. We weren't confirmed. I wasn't confirmed.
You weren't?
No.
You didn't have to be?
No. I haven't been baptized. Which is strange, because when my father, in his 50s, he resigned from ICI and became a vicar in the Church of England. So it's a bit of a mystery to me. I mean, I'm an atheist, but I don't think I was very exercised about questions of religion at school. I remember talk, obviously, as everyone does, and so I don't know how I became an atheist, as it were. But
was it after school or at school? Or?
It was gradual, I think. I mean, we had no religion. My mother was an atheist. She told me when she was dying, but we never had any religious upbringing at all at home. Later, through the memoir that my father wrote, I discovered that he had some contact with religious groups in Oxford when he was an undergraduate. But that obviously didn't have much effect, or I don't know whether he had. I don't know my father's sort of trajectory towards becoming a vicar. He became a vicar after my mother died. He married again. My stepmother, Wendy, is a vicar. She became a vicar after marrying him. So there was obviously a great change in his life. But to me, I was mystified really. And I never saw him as a vicar. And I find it rather difficult to know, given his character of this rather stern person. I mean, a good man, but I can't imagine him. He obviously did make very strong impact in his parish in Williston in the Wirral. And at his funeral, the church was packed. But I can't say that I had any kind of crisis at all, or
have you been interested in religion since at all?
No, not really. No. I mean, I've read a lot about religion, obviously history of religion and so on, but not in terms of my own. I haven't felt. I mean, I admire some religious groups. I was very involved in campaign against nuclear weapons at the CND, and came into contact with Quakers in the course of that. Saw what they do. But otherwise, no, not really.
What about politics? Sometimes at school, one joins debating societies or becomes a member of some political affiliation, and later at university. What about you?
Well, again, I have to disappoint you, really. I'm quite political now, but I wasn't at school, or even at university here. I didn't belong to any political society here in Cambridge. I was preoccupied with the arts and architecture and a bit of marginally involved in theatre and so on. I was involved in good causes. I remember working for Shelter, and I've become more political as time has gone by, I think, and maybe the political situation has deteriorated in the country. I'm a member of the Labour Party, but I can't say that I was. My wife, Ruth, was very active in left-wing politics here, and then later on. But for me, it was more gradual.
What about your parents? Were they Labour supporters?
I can only guess. My father took the Times. My mother used to read The Guardian, the Manchester Guardian, as was. I never talked to them about politics really until much later in my father's life. I imagine, this is purely imagined, I really don't know, that he was fairly conservative as a businessman. I know that he was very dismayed by what then happened to British industry and ICI with its sort of financialisation, if that's the right word. He was interested in making chemicals, but I think he saw the way in which ICI was broken up and so on. But that's only one aspect of politics. I think he moved left with being a vicar, and he was certainly involved in many practical schemes of in the parish in Williston. But as I say, I never really talked to him. I don't know how he voted.
What about music? Because,
music, yes.
The Dragon, you and I partook in Iolanthe together.
We did. We sang the chorus of Iolanthe. We were. That's right.
Chorus of peers. So it was downhill all the way from then. But
well, I have sang on stage since then, but hardly to great acclaim. Yes, I can't claim to have any great knowledge or expertise in music. I don't play an instrument. My wife plays the piano quite well. My father played the French horn, as I mentioned. So we had music at home. My father loved music. We had classical, like Mozart, but we also had music from shows and so on. I liked pop music. I was from its beginnings, and it was the 60s, so
The Beatles.
The Beatles, absolutely, yes. I was very keen on the Beatles. And in fact, I saw the Beatles on stage here in Cambridge on their first tour. They were second on the bill. The first on the bill was Chris Montez, a name that has now passed from history.
Was this at the Corn Exchange?
No, it was in one of the cinemas. And in fact, I went to a dance where the Rolling Stones played.
Yeah.
So I was very keen on pop music, and I kept up with that. And I used to go to a few shows in London, and but I now have a very eclectic, Catholic, and slightly superficial series of tastes in music. I love music, but
which among the classicals? Which
I like piano music. I like 19th century and early 20th. I like French Poulenc and Chabrier, and I like Chopin. I don't like opera really. I don't like grand opera. I like Purcell and Monteverdi. I like music with melody. I like clear music, as it were. I'm not too keen on romantic music. I like formality in music, I suppose.
Some people, when they're working, like to have music in the background as an inspiration or as some kind of drug or something. Do you work with music?
I can't.
Yeah.
I can't work with music or the sound of voices. I find it very hard when I'm really reading and writing. Yes. The only time I have music when I work is when I'm doing drawing, which is not a large part of my life, but I very much enjoy drawing. The kind of drawing I do now is architectural drawing for illustrations for papers and books and that kind of thing, which I love. I do it by hand. I don't do computer drawing, and I listen to music then. But drawing is an opportunity for thinking. I mean, some people say to me, Phil, why are you doing all this hand drawing? You could do it all more quickly. But actually, it isn't a waste of time. It's an opportunity to think about what one's drawing, but also about other matters. And I like the skill of drawing. I mean, though I say myself, I think I'm nothing outstanding, but I'm quite skilled at architectural drawing, and I really enjoy that because there is a kind of, I suppose it's, I wouldn't know, but maybe it's like mastering a musical instrument. There's a pleasure in knowing that you can do certain things, and it comes out.
You then came on to Cambridge.
Yes.
Why Cambridge?
I wanted to be an architect, as I've said, and in my father's vision of things, it had to be Oxford or Cambridge, and Oxford didn't do architecture. I think that was probably the reasoning, but I was sent, really. They said, Phil, you're going to Cambridge to read architecture, so I took the examinations. I got in. I've still got the letter which Leslie Martin, who was the professor and the head of department, wrote to my father saying Philip has got a place. So that was the reason. Since then, Oxford has a very good architecture school in Oxford Brookes, but all my father and mother and my brother have all gone to Oxford. So
You came to Trinity Hall.
I came to Trinity Hall. That I don't know how that choice was made, because it's a law college, isn't it? Yes. But I enjoyed it there and made friends there.
Did you enjoy your undergraduate
career? Undergraduate time. It was a kind of trajectory was continuously downwards, I'm ashamed to say. I did enjoy it, and I did well in the first year. And the first year I worked very hard, and it was all exciting, and it was rather abstract. It was more of a kind of, as one might say, sort of art school kind of exercises. We were starting to do buildings, but that came a bit later. We worked in a studio, so you were alongside other people working, and I enjoyed that. And you learnt a lot, of course, from working alongside other students. But I think I then became interested in other things. I was diverted by all delights that Cambridge has. I became interested in magazines and graphic design. I did a lot of work on that. And I did progressively worse until after 3 years I got a 2-2. And it's a 5-year course, and there was the 4th and 5th years of a diploma, and that I had to resit. So it was not auspicious. Mm. How I became an academic is a mystery. I would have been thrown out these days. I couldn't have made it. But somehow I was admitted to do a PhD.
So
But I think it was because as I say, I was very academic, but I didn't. I think I in the end, I didn't really get to grips with the designing of buildings in detail, and I didn't become a practicing architect. I became a theorist and a historian and so on. And I think that, now I look back, I think that was the sort of parting of the ways, as it were. I have been in practice briefly for just in vacations, as it were, short periods. But I think I gradually realised that I wasn't destined for an architect's office, probably.
Mm.
Perhaps I'm making excuses for myself. But
were there any particular highlights otherwise? I mean, were you involved with any of the societies, and you met your wife and so on?
I met my wife, yes, that was very much a highlight. In fact, I met her through a society, because I was active in the Society of Arts, which had talks from painters and designers and philosophers and all kinds of people weekly in term, and we had a dinner at Miller's and went on to have a talk, and I was very much involved in that, and met some very interesting people, and had some strange experiences. I became more and more interested in the arts. I wasn't particularly active myself, but with friends I became interested in two fields of art. One was concrete poetry, visual poetry, which is halfway between graphic art and poetry, and kinetic art. And we had an exhibition, four of us organised an exhibition in St. Catherine's College, a very grandly titled International Exhibition of Kinetic and Concrete Poetry. And then a bit later, with two others, I started a magazine called Form, which was it was more or less a quarterly. And I published it and designed it, and the three of us edited it. It was devoted to form and structure in the arts, rather grandly, and to these two fields, kinetic art and concrete poetry. And it also looked, there was sort of contemporary side of it, and it looked back to sort of precursors in geometric abstraction and those sort of fields in the pre-war period, 1930s, 1920s. So that started small and built up. We published 10 numbers of that. So I kind of veered away into history of art, design. I nearly became a graphic designer. I'm very glad I didn't, but I nearly. I did student magazines, and I was asked, I don't know how it came about, but I was asked by Mark Boxer, who's a journalist, who was the editor of the Sunday Times colour magazine, which was the first of the colour magazines, would I go and work on that, which I did in one vacation and enjoyed it. It was terrific. And he said at the end, would I carry on? And I said, well, I'd better go back and finish architecture. I think it would have been not exactly a dead end, but a kind of, no, I'm glad I didn't do that, but it was fun at the time.
And were there any particular negative experiences. You mentioned some funny occasions. We were thrown into the river.
Well, I think I'm not sure I should say too much, but I mean I did. I mean, being at all-male boarding schools, I didn't really know much about women before I arrived here in Cambridge. So that was. I won't talk to you in great detail about that, but obviously my experience. I came to
there weren't many here to.
So that was where and that was my experiences with girlfriends was up and down, but I did meet my wife to be quite early on, and then she went away and had an affair with somebody else. But we.
You're just about to.
We're just about to have our golden wedding, so yes, we managed to last all that long time.
Were there any teachers who, either in your own subject or other people, I mean, or authors? Because, for example, Pevsner was writing his guides to architecture and so on around the place about that time, or a little earlier, perhaps.
Yes.
But were there any lecturers here or elsewhere who really influenced you?
There were indeed. What I hadn't realised until afterwards, when I came here as a student, I thought, well, this is what universities are like, and this is what schools of architecture are like. I didn't realise that I had hit a very extraordinary period in the history of the School of Architecture here in Cambridge, through the person of Leslie Martin, who had been the architect of the London County Council, and who was appointed, I think, in 1956. And I think Noel Annan, as I found out later, the Provost of King's, I believe was working behind the scenes, was instrumental in getting Leslie Martin appointed. And the school before him, I shouldn't be too critical, but it was quite provincial. The teachers were mostly local practitioners of architecture, some of whom were teaching when I was there, and they did very good things. But Martin brought in a number of lecturers, amongst whom were C.A. St. John Wilson, Sandy Wilson, who was the architect of the British Library and worked as a partner with Leslie Martin. There was a man called Colin Rowe, who became the Dean of Architecture at Cornell, who's well known as a writer on architecture, critic and historian. And Peter Eisenman, who was a young American architect who has become very famous. And they were all teaching in studios, and so we really had an amazing set of people teaching studio and teaching history and theory. So yes, I particularly enjoyed Sandy Wilson's lectures because a lot of the European modernism was not all that well known about, and he brought those Corbusier futurism and the Stil and these kind of European movements. He lectured on those and was married to Muriel Wilson, who was worked for the Arts Council, and they both, Sandy Wilson became a great connoisseur and collector of pop art and had an amazing collection in his house. I worked for him for a short time. So there were, yes, certainly. We had less contact with the School of Architecture was quite hermetic. We didn't make as much contact with other departments, even engineering and so on, as one should have done, I think. The one thing we did do, it was the beginning of computers, and the beginning of computers very beginning of computers in architecture.
Computer-aided design.
Computer-aided design, which I became very interested in, yes. And when I arrived, there was, as you perhaps remember, there was just one university computer, the EDSAC machine. There was a man called Ivan Sutherland who was at MIT and who wrote a thesis called Sketchpad, and he really invented computer-aided design in engineering. People say all philosophy is footnotes to Plato. Well, all computer-aided design is footnotes to Sutherland. And he had an amazing system, and he came here to the mathematical laboratory in Cambridge, 1963, and some of us architectural students went, and we thought, well, goodness, this is going to change architecture, which it did, of course. Well, I don't know if it changed architectural design, but it certainly changed the practice of architecture and the tools of architecture, transformed them. And so we became very interested, and that was part of how I got into research. I carried on continuously from my course in architecture to being taken on by Leslie Martin to work on research projects, and then to join a research centre called the Centre for Land Use and Built Form Studies, of which Leslie Martin...
Did you do a PhD, did you say?
I did do a PhD. I never got it. My PhD, I'll tell you the story of my PhD, which is a tragedy, really. Part of my further downward tragedy, well, not quite. I decided to write a thesis on biological analogy with architecture.
This is the man who wrote, I've forgotten the author's name, the great book on form and whatever.
Darcy Thompson.
Yes.
He figured strongly, yes, very much. Yes, a hero, yes, great man. Classicist, mathematician, and biologist, yes. And in fact, one of my examiners was a man called Lancelot Law White, who did an exhibition of the work of Darcy Thompson at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London in 1951. Anyway, I set out on this very ambitious subject. There was no book before, no thesis really. There were articles and so on, which is strange because there is a long history from the beginnings of biology in the 18th century of analogies with architecture, because it's, of all the sciences, it's a subject that deals with design. But it's fragmented, and architects being sort of jackdaw people who, pick bits and pieces, made different kinds of analogies with, structure, engineering structure with skeletons, and the kind of relation of a building to its environment as being like ecological relationships of organisms. So I worked at this and wrote a thesis and submitted it. And I forget the order, but I had 3 examiners who died in the course of, not during vivas, but in the course of examination. Lancelot Law White, who was an old man, a philosopher of biology. The trouble is the thesis was too, spread its net too widely, and I wasn't really supervised properly. Well, I wasn't supervised at all.
Wasn't Martin meant to be your supervisor?
He was. I never met him once for a supervision. It's extraordinary. It was very unusual for people to be doing PhDs then, and I don't know how I was allowed to start.
So these people died, but surely they appointed other people?
I had 4 committees, 4 panels, and I had 3 vivas, during the course of which took several years, and during that time I rewrote the thesis and had it published as a book by Cambridge University Press. And at that point I thought, what am I doing? Having a sort of long previous version.
You could have got a PhD under special regulations if you bothered. Oh, yes.
Could I?
Well, on the book you could now.
I did, after a time, get an SCD. I submitted published works, including that book. So it was a very strange story. I mean, it was a real disappointment at the time, but so I withdrew. So I don't have a PhD. But I did go into research and worked on some applied projects that Leslie Martin had. In the first place it was the era, as you know, great expansion of English universities, and he had quite a lot of work on university buildings, and we did a project, or more than one project, on sort of programming in the architectural sense for university building, university planning. But I simultaneously was working on mathematical topics with a friend of mine.
Got to the time when you're doing research projects with Leslie Martin.
Yes.
That lasted for how long?
It was about 10 years, I guess. I think I said to you before I'm very bad on dates, but it was about 10 years. And that was a fantastic time. Again, I've come to realise that there are times, I'm sure you know, in university life, when groups come together, or there is a moment when something is happening that isn't the kind of general run of academic life. And that was true in this group that Leslie Martin and my friend Lionel March started, Centre for Land Use and Built Form Studies, just over 50 years ago. And that was very exciting. It was exciting because it was the beginnings of an architectural research that hadn't really existed. Leslie Martin was keen that architecture be brought into universities, which was to some extent, but generally not, and that it be supported by research, and nobody quite knew what that was. It was also at the moment when there were at the beginnings of computing. It was also the kind of ferment of ideas about quantification, mathematical models in social sciences, in geography and archaeology and so on. So there was that was the kind of intellectual, that was a sort of in what was happening inside the group, as it were. But it was also a moment in the 60s when, in post-war reconstruction and its sequels, there was a lot of building going on. There were research groups in government departments. We were mostly funded by government departments and so on. So that really set me, I guess, on what I've been doing ever since. And I find myself going back. Sometimes I think to myself, you know, what have we... I said this 40 years ago and I'm still saying it, but maybe that's okay. But I became great friends with this chap Lionel March, who was an architect who'd been a mathematician. We wrote a book together called The Geometry of Environment, which was a book that was brought together architecture and mathematics. It was discrete mathematics, mathematics of symmetry and set theory, graph theory and so on. It was meant to be to introduce architecture to introduce mathematics of that kind into architecture. But also we hope to introduce some mathematicians to architectural ideas. Ambitious. There was also the hints. We didn't talk too much about computers there, but there was what was needed at that point in order to build mathematical models of buildings and architectural phenomena in cities was a way of representing spatial arrangement and geometry for the computer, and so our book focused on those kinds of issues that then became important for the development of, I don't want to give it too much importance, but that it was the kind of mathematics that then became built into computer-aided design.
Were you involved? I mean, Cambridge CAD became...
I was, yes. I mean, I should make it clear, I'm not a computer scientist and I've only written a few little programs, but I was very much involved in an organisational way. We had what happened was that in the research there was, we did work for these government departments and built in some cases computer models, and they wanted more work and they asked for continuation work, which was not of great research interest, but we felt it was important to do that. So we set up a company. It was called Applied Research of Cambridge in 1969. And 20 of us from the department put in £100 each, and we had one half-time employee, and it went from there. And that did consulting work, but it also started to build computer-aided design systems for architects and engineers and planners.
So that was the company that started CAD?
It was an early company. It was, I think, probably the first in the world in architectural CAD. There were other computer-aided design firms, and there were big consulting firms that specialised in acoustics and that sort of thing, who were doing computer applications. But ours, I think, was certainly very early in the field. Yes, yes. And it grew fast, doubled in size every year.
Has it continued? Or?
No, it came to an end in 1984. It was partly we built big tailor-made systems for large clients. They were very expensive. They were mainly for building of hospitals. And so they were systems where you could charge £100,000 whatever. They ran on big computers. That world changed in the 1980s with the desktop computing, and the whole business changed. And we saw it coming, but we were bought out by McDonnell Douglas, the aircraft company. So I was my involvement in that. I was a consultant, and I worked in the Middle East. I was the Middle Eastern man, which was slightly farcical. But I was on the board of the company. So my work was mainly helping run the company, not producing.
Where in the Middle East? I mean, you must have travelled around.
Yes, I worked in Iran. There was a university called, it was part of the, it was called Pahlavi University. It was Shah, the dynasty. It was in Shiraz in the south, desert city, beautiful. Have you been there? And it was an established university, technical university, agriculture, engineering, medicine, and they were building a new campus. And so we were advising on not me, but they sought advice on the curriculum and organisation as well as buildings. It was very interesting, but and we produced designs, but events overtook us. The Shah fell, and I don't know what happened. I doubt if our plans were implemented.
Then, at some point you moved to London next, is that right?
No, I moved from here to the Open University. I spent a long time at the Open University. I went there because this colleague who I'd written this book with and worked in land use and built form studies, March, he moved to the Open University to a department of design, and it was very unusually not qualified. Usually departments of design are engineering design, product design, architectural design. It was just design, so it was quite broad. And he was then also able to make quite a few appointments, and he assembled a multidisciplinary group looking at issues of spatial arrangement and configuration, which is what I was fascinated by, and he brought in other people. And it was called the Centre for Configurational Studies, of which I was the director. I had the choice. I had the luxury of being offered two jobs, or getting two jobs. One was a lectureship in the Open University, and the other was a assistant director of research here in Cambridge. And I took the Open University job, and people here said, "What on earth are you doing?" But actually, it was much more interesting to go to that group. I stayed too long in the Open University, I'm a great believer. I am a great believer in the Open University and what it does. And one of the great things about it is that it allows you to teach very broadly across subjects which appealed to me, and I taught in the history of art and as well as in technology and some other subjects. But I went there because of the research group that was being set up.
Your teaching in the history of art perhaps leads us into another rich vein of gold, because the book of yours, of course, I know best is the one on Vermeer. When did you start that, and why did you start that?
Well, I've always been interested in drawing and in geometry, and it came out of an interest in perspective. And I taught a summer school class at the Open University on perspective and drawing, and a practical class. And I thought, what should we do? And one of the things I decided that we would do was to work perspective backwards, to go from a picture to the three-dimensional scene depicted. So I chose Dutch interiors of the 17th century for the sort of strange reason that they have tiled floors. And the tiled floor is the key. You can reconstruct perspective pictures in other ways, but with a tiled floor, it gives you a kind of scale that allows you to determine the sizes of objects at different distances in the scene. And so we did that, and I started to look at Vermeer's work, which I knew slightly but not particularly well, and saw, as anyone does, if you look at the interiors, that quite a lot of them seem to be the same room. And I thought, is it the same room? In a geometrical sense. So I reconstructed, I think, a dozen of the pictures, and cut a long story short, showed that they are, with some discrepancies. A lot of them are some variations in detail, but it is the same room. So that's how it started. So it was nothing to do with what the subject of the book particularly, which is about Vermeer's use of the camera obscura. It was an exercise in perspective, so that came out of my interest in drawing and geometry. And then I started to read the literature of Vermeer and discovered that really for 100 years people had been talking about Vermeer and optics. Soon after the kind of resuscitation of Vermeer's reputation in the 1860s by Théophile Thoré, people started to say they look like photographs. The Goncourt brothers in their journal said Vermeer is the only artist who's made a daguerreotype of the red brick houses of his country. And then quite soon people started to say, well, did he use optical aids? And various people did experiments and published results, and the main evidence for Vermeer using a camera was that he seemed to reproduce artifacts of lenses that you wouldn't see with the naked eye. In particular, if you have highlights on reflective surfaces, they reflect the sources of the light. And if you're, as we are in an interior, the highlight would be rectangular because it's reflecting a window. He shows them as circles, true circles, and they're circles because they've slightly unfocused lenses spread points of light into circles because of the circularity of the lens, essentially. So the idea that Vermeer used a camera was quite general, but I tackled the subject from another direction, which was the geometry of this room. And it's slightly difficult to explain without a diagram, but you can find the positions, the theoretical viewpoints of all the pictures in this room. Points, not all in the same place, but all in the same area. And for each viewpoint, what is described in each picture is what is contained within a pyramid on its side, with the point at the viewpoint of the picture. So I reconstructed these. In one picture, in the Queen's collection, the music lesson, on the far wall you see a plain mirror which reflects what's behind you and reflects the back wall of the room. And if you take these pyramids of view, carry the lines through the viewpoint onto the back wall, you get a rectangle. And in about half a dozen cases, perhaps more, that's the same size as Vermeer's canvas. And my interpretation was that he has a lens he's projecting onto the back wall, and that's the reason for the coincidence of the size of the projected image with the canvas. So that was how it happened. I didn't know what I was doing when I discovered that. It's interesting to look back and
do you remember a particular moment?
Yes, I remember doing the drawing, but I didn't quite know. I knew in my unconsciously, obviously, what it meant, but I didn't immediately realize its implications. I did it without thinking. Well, but with thinking, but not conscious. I didn't think I'll do this drawing. Yes, I do. I remember that very, very vividly. Yes.
Do you remember the day and the place?
As I've said before, I never remember dates and place. I remember place. Well, it was at home in Buckinghamshire. Yes, and I remember going to show people who didn't appreciate quite what I was talking about. But yes, that was, and then I wrote it up as a book, and I thought, this is quite specialised and a sort of technical thing. And then I didn't realise how controversial it would be, or how generally people might be interested in it. But it turned out to be both, which was fantastic. And one of the best things about publishing the book was that it generated a fantastic, very large correspondence from all over the world, all sorts of people. Not particularly art historians, they didn't like it, but artists, photographers, filmmakers, other people wrote long messages.
There was a film made about it, and it's featured in a number of films.
It has featured in quite a number of films, yes. It generated, because it interested particularly filmmakers and photographers. So I got involved in all kinds of adventures, and I got to meet all kinds of people. It changed my life in two ways. It changed my life in that it led on to all kinds of occasions and meeting people and collaborating with people. But it has also changed my confidence, I think. Now I think back on it, that I felt I could do things. I mean, I was a complete outsider as far as history of art was concerned. But then I thought, well, okay, I can perhaps do more of these kinds of things. So, yeah. But it was, what I hadn't anticipated was that it would be that Vermeer specialists would find it so painful and so bitter. To me, it's...
Well, they thought it was diminishing his art.
Yes, diminishing Vermeer's genius. It was crass, it was a kind of intrusion of... But as I've said to various people, Vermeer's perspectives are extremely accurate, internally, highly consistent. There's two ways you can do that. One is you can copy optical images. The other is you can construct them geometrically, which is a kind of machine. It's an algorithm. Why is that not cheating? I don't see. I mean, what was interesting? One of the interesting reactions was that from painters who said, "Okay, it's a technology. You know, artists are always interested in technical means. If they do what they want, if they can do something interesting and new, which is what I think Vermeer saw. Vermeer saw a way of recording effects of light in ways that hadn't been achieved before. Why not? That's my view. And of course, that in the 17th century, it would have been an achievement of the imagination. I think the idea that of cheating is a kind of 20th century notion, in a way.
Was that...
It's associated with photography, pardon me.
There must have been quite a lot of contemporary evidence that he had some sort of box in his studio with a...
Nothing. There's practically nothing. Very little known about his life, very little... that he's mentioned in a few people's memoirs. Constantine Huygens went to see him, father of Christian. On one occasion records... Well, it's not recorded by Huygens, it's recorded by another person who was present. There was a man called Balthazar de Monconis, French expert in optics and a diplomat. Both of them, men very intimately involved in optical science of the time, both Monconis and Huygens, but they don't say he had a box or no. There were contemporaries who were interested in the camera obscura.
Caravaggio, wasn't it?
Caravaggio's a different case. He's a bit earlier. The camera obscura emerges in late 16th. It's curious. Well, that's to say, people put lenses in cameras, which is the key to getting a bright, clear image. Previously, we just had a pinhole and it's very faint. But those only really emerged in late 16th. David Hockney, who I've got to know through the Vermeer book, because he wrote a book about art and optics that came out more or less at the same time, he argues that Caravaggio used optics, but that he used a concave mirror, with which one can cast images. And David Hockney has experimented, other people have, and there's very strange underpainting in Caravaggios which suggest in his portraits you have figure paintings. There are marks where various key points on the figure are. They're not outlines, but they seem to be positioning marks. Well, why would you put that on the canvas? I mean, if you wanted to film somebody and get them back to the same position or paint them, you'd make marks on the chair, on the floor. But why on the canvas? Well, it's because you want to get an optical image registered again in the right place. So that's very suggestive. And I think people have accepted. And again, with Caravaggio, there is contemporary evidence that he had lenses. He worked for Cardinal...
Whoever.
one of the cardinals, I'll come to in a moment, Del Monte. He had mirrors. He made holes in the ceiling of his lodgings to get sun in. There's various details that, yes.
What about Hockney? Because from Caravaggio onwards, there are these devices, but as you know, Hockney claims that from the middle of the 15th century that basically the Renaissance discovery perspective is the result of a secret device which was kept in these very well populated workshops with thousands of apprentices, written about in detail by various historians of art at the time and by Leonardo and others. And this device was kept entirely secret for 2 centuries and explains the Renaissance. What do you feel about this?
I don't buy it. No. David Hockney's book, The Secret Knowledge, is a frustrating book because it's. I accept if the general thesis of the book is artists used optics more frequently than is generally recognised in conventional history of art. I think that is true. And David Hockney says photography didn't start in 1840s. There is a longer history of a kind of optical art. But then he treats individual artists and makes large claims, which I think are not really supported in detail. I mean, I am absolutely convinced about Vermeer. But in other cases, I think David Hockney latches on to fragments of information. In some cases, I think he has a case. In others, I'm dubious. And the idea that somehow that the Renaissance is explained by use of essentially concave mirrors, I think not. I mean,
because it starts, as you know, with that very telling wall of David Hockney with paintings up to about 1380, 1400, which lack this true perspective, and then suddenly it all changes. So he has a real problem. But his solution.
It is a real problem. It's a real issue, and I think Martin Kemp, who was a supporter of David Hockney, is a professor of history of art at Oxford, great expert in optics and perspective and so on. He makes the case that David Hockney has, by taking this kind of long view and this very synoptic kind of overview of Western painting, raises an issue which is not being sufficiently discussed. The traditional explanations tend to be along the lines of the introduction of oil paints in northern painting, the Van Eycks and so on, humanistic focus of the Renaissance, the interest in portraiture, individual portraiture, which wasn't there before, those kinds of explanations which and there is, of course, a rise in interest in optics with Leonardo and others, and invention of perspective technique and so on. And the notion that the mirror is something that can produce pictures. I think the mirror plays a very interesting part, not perhaps enough discussed. Plain mirrors, which produce pictures immediately, of course. I think some of the arguments that were made by Hockney and his people in optics who'd helped him are dubious. And one of the things that one has to say, how much can be done by skill and what David would call eyeballing, looking. I mean, some painters are extraordinarily skilled. He and I went with a group to see the Van Eyck altarpiece in Ghent. It's just unbelievable. And this is supposedly before the introduction of formal perspective methods. And Van Eyck paints church interiors, and you think, they're not exact perspectives, but he's painting them in a way that he understands all of the kind of geometry of them. So how far can you get without formal techniques? Or, I mean, that's an empirical question, isn't it? I'm interested in if I have another project to do, it would be something about perspective and picture making, about the interaction of techniques of perspective with how pictures are made, and how technique influences what is painted or what is drawn. And that I'm going to try and test myself with some of these things. How well can I... There's a man called James Elkins, who I admire, who's at the Chicago Institute of Art, and he made a claim that one of the exercises that is often used in perspective books is drawing a lute, complex curved object. And he said, I can draw a lute from memory. And he probably can. The question is, how good can he get? Yes. Or drawing a lute, just looking at a lute, Some people can jolly well do that. So I think that's interesting, as you say.
Well, we're just about coming towards the end of the interview, but I always tend to ask people if there's any area of their life that they consider they should have been asked about, which is really important. I mean, you've done many other things to do with CO2 emissions and planning and many things which we could have covered, but these are in your books and well known. But is there anything specific you would have liked me to ask you about?
I thought you might have been going to ask me what would I have done if I hadn't done what I've done.
Yes.
Do you ask people that sometimes?
What would you have done?
What would I have done if
I'd... Become a specialist in Gilbert and Sullivan.
If I'd have done another... I would have liked to have gone into films. I don't think I'd have been very good, because films are... Well, I mean, I imagine myself as a director, of course. Then you have to command other people. I'm not sure I'd be very good at that, but I'm fascinated by the process of filmmaking and the artifice of film, maybe animated film, or I don't know. So that's one area. And I've seen sort of film from the margins. I've taken part occasionally in bits of film and so on. And I've always found that very intriguing. Otherwise, I'd like to have been a biologist, but I would have to have been a 19th century biologist. Biology is now sort of industrialized and huge teams and minute subjects and so on. But reading about the history of biology, as I did for my thesis, I became very interested in the history of the theory of biology and evolutionary theory and so on. But whether I'd have made any headway in biology, I don't know. But that's a subject I would have enjoyed.
Well, you're young.
We're another career, yes.
We're young. Start afresh.
Exactly. Why not?
Finally, your family. You mentioned Ruth.
Yes.
Coming up to your golden wedding anniversary.
Right.
Do you have any children? Or
I have one daughter called Lily, who is a curator, museum curator, in Leamington Spa. There is a local museum, and there are two of them. Well, actually, I think the other one's resigned, but anyway, there were two of them, and the other one did paintings, and Lily does everything else. So it's one of those museums that has big collection. And she is married to Tom, who is a philosopher, Tom Crowther, at Warwick University, whose work I don't entirely understand. And they have two children. I have two grandchildren, Isaac and Beatrice.
Lovely.
Who are lovely.
Yes, lovely names too. Good. Well, on that cheerful note, thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you. It's been really enjoyable. Thank you very much.